Hello and welcome to another Tippling Philosopher video, one I haven't done for a very long time. Indeed, at the moment I am in a clinic in Moscow receiving stem cell treatment for my primary progressive multiple sclerosis, which is why I have these beautiful little catheters sticking out my neck. Hopefully they won't put you off. So I'm going to talk to you today about your options for God, really. And I see the options for God as really falling into two very sharp categories and without a lot of wriggle room either way. And I was talking about this with my mate, one of the founding members of Tippling Philosophers, the other night, and just seeing where logic would get us to when we were trying to work out what God would be like. And I think really there are only two options, as I say. The first option is an abstract version of God, a really compartmentalized, determined, constrained idea of God. And the second version is a much more human, much less godlike version of God, of open theism, where God wouldn't know the future of freely willed decisions if such things could exist. And I don't think it's very easy to create another God that fits within that range, or it would just be a different range of less than godliness. So let's start with that first perfect being, one entity that we could arrive at if we're thinking in terms of perfect being theology, where you're thinking, what's the most perfect being I can possibly conceive of? Sort of the ontological argument. So if God is to be perfection personified, or the entity of perfection, and I know there's a lot of problem with defining perfection, but I'm going to leave that to the side, then God's actions must by definition be absolutely perfect each and every time. God can't make mistakes, God can't act imperfectly, God can't make poor decisions, God can't create imperfectly. If he fails in any of these things, then he simply isn't, or she or it simply isn't, the most perfect being that you can imagine. So there's no room for a kind of corruption of this perfection. Now, to the average Christian thinker, and let's take Christianity as a default here, this is a really common understanding of God, the kind of omni-God, all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing, this kind of perfect arrangement of those qualities. There's nothing greater that can be conceived of. And so God gets pigeonholed into this sort of abstract corner where he is constrained by those aspects of his nature that we think he must have. His nature is effectively a perfect prison cell, encaging him and surrounding him so that he can only act within its confines. And this is the whole idea, I suppose, behind the Euthyphro dilemma. It's God's nature that underwrites all his good actions. Things are good because God's nature is good, but then if his nature is good, he can't appear to act outside of his nature. So there's no way that God could be anything other than good, which means that God's got a very sort of linear path to live, to lead. This is a kind of the same with humanity when we talk about, can we act outside our natures? Well, no, because that's not who we are. I can't act as someone who's completely different to me because that's not who I am. My DNA and my environment and my learning just won't kind of permit that. If I do act outside of my nature, then that is necessarily actually just part of my nature. So we have this problem where to be outside of your nature is not to be yourself. So God cannot act outside of God's nature, which means that he has no free will, no wriggle room. He's just this constrained idea of what can be the maximal, optimal, perfect being. He doesn't have that real and actual ability to act outside of his own nature. For God, he couldn't just go and rape and murder billions of people over millennia, or Christians would say he wouldn't be able to, because that's just not his nature. Well, then he doesn't have that power. He's just constrained into being this being that's boxed up over here, this abstract being. Of course, if you read the Bible, you might disagree with that statement anyway. So it's all about God's nature. God can't do this, it's not his nature. He can't do evil because that's not his nature. So on and so forth. And in the end, we just have this this very linear understanding of God, where he can only do that which is maximally perfect to do. And the only other option that might be open to him would be if he had an option of two things that, when morally calculated, were morally identical. And so therefore choosing between one event or decision and another would be kind of random and arbitrary. So we have this idea of God being constrained by his nature, and then really it's very difficult to see that God would have any kind of personhood, any kind of personality. It's just some kind of logical construct, and it's very difficult to think how you could come to love a being like that unconditionally, that would have no... I mean, we understand love between humans and between our fellow people who are close to us, and that just wouldn't happen with this abstract idea that sits outside of the universe and abstracted out there to only be just a bunch of logical properties. I don't know how you could come to love that thing, and yet that seems to be the main philosophical conclusion for what God is. Now, the other sort of God is there then something very much less than that, the kind of less than God approach, the one that we might see in open theism. Open theism is this idea that God doesn't know future counterfactuals, doesn't know the sorts of things that might happen. If this happens, then this will happen, because God doesn't know the future of freely willed decisions. Now, I don't believe in free will, as well, but if you were to assume that I was to make a decision and God doesn't know 100% what the outcome of that decision is, and there are other decisions that get based on that, then actually the whole matrix of events that come out of my decision that God doesn't know the answer for would mean that God can't know the future at all. In fact, it's almost like the universe is just rolling a bunch of dice and seeing how it plays out. It's a kind of random and arbitrary construction that God has no omniscience of. There's no divine foreknowledge of what will happen. And this makes God very much less than the godly perfect being of perfect being theology that many people assume God is, the God of classical theism, omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent. So this makes God more human, and therefore maybe more able for humans to enter into a loving relationship with. But I think it creates far more problems than it solves. It doesn't particularly gel well with what we know about, from the Bible and from our theology. I mean, God could make maybe intelligent guesses about how people might act at the end of the day, but their free will supposedly dictate what they do. And this doesn't gel particularly well with psychology and science in general, that show that humans are eminently predictable. I mean, for goodness sake, even Facebook can predict our personalities better than our own family members based on a certain amount of likes. So big data appears to have more scope for prediction of humanity than this kind of God, arguably. So this version of God certainly seems somewhat less than God as we know him or her or it, and without omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence, or without that kind of knowledge, those aspects of God suffer. And if you don't know the outcomes of particular counterfactuals, then being able to do something about any given scenario is also problematic. The whole of the universe appears to become a little bit random. So it's hard to do the most loving thing if you don't know what the most loving thing is to do. right? If you are effectively ignorant of the future, then you can be a fairly intelligent being, but you're not going to get it right every time. So on the one hand, we have this constrained, boxed up version of God who appears to have no real personhood or personality of its own, sort of blindly conforms to a set of rules and nature about which it appears to have no control over. Or at least, if he defied those rules, he would not be the good God that people believed him to be. And on the other hand, we have the God that appears to be less than God, just kind of like a superhuman, although it might invite more people to sort of enter into a relationship with that God, as you see commonalities of imperfections, almost human personhood. But it's not really the God that we see, that we come to understand from theology. I mean, certain areas of the Bible might lead you to believe that there is a God like that, because there is a kind of personification of God or an anthropomorphism of God in the Bible. But, therein lies some issues in the Bible. And this kind of dichotomy is really where I see the God problem existing. I'm not sure there are any decent answers to get around this, but I'll be interested if you have any comments below. But I think that both ideas of God are really problematic and are fairly terminal for theism in general. Anyway, just thought I'd throw in a video. I haven't seen you guys for a long time. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed.